Pseudopod is extruded into this universe from a dimension of purest fear. It's beautiful in its own alien way, but what's to come will unsettle you.
Pseudopod, episode 625 for December 7th, 2018. Two stories by Manly Wade Wellman, The Golgotha Dancers and These Doth the Lord Hate. I'm Oren Gray, and I'll be your host for this week's episode of Pseudopod. Regular listeners will know me as the author of such episodes as The Worm That Gnaws and this year's Halloween episode Goblins. But for those who don't, I'm a writer, editor, amateur film scholar, and monster expert, as well as the author of 3 collections of strange stories, most recently Guignol and Other Sardonic Tales, which you can get from Word Horde. As a writer who works primarily in the cobwebbed corner usually referred to as weird fiction, my work gets inevitably and inexorably tied up with that of H.P. Lovecraft. Over the years, my stories have appeared in more than a dozen publications with the word Lovecraft or Cthulhu in the titles. Like many people, Lovecraft was one of my gateways to this wide, weird world. But when asked about my influences, I usually say that there are 3 old dead white guy writers who give us a much clearer picture of what I'm trying to do with my own fiction. E.F. Benson, William Hope Hodgson, and Manly Wade Wellman. Wellman was a late contemporary of Lovecraft, his stories gracing a variety of pulp magazines ranging from astounding stories to startling stories to strange stories and, of course, to the legendary Weird Tales. Perhaps best known for his tales drawing and elaborating on the folklore of the Appalachian Mountains, the 2 stories that we've got for you this week are a little different from those, but still showcase Wellman's skill as a raconteur and his ability to mix real history and folklore with his own imagination to create a witch's brew more potent even than the sum of its parts. The Golgotha Dancers was originally published in Weird Tales, October 1937. Narrating this is Andrew Lehman. Andrew is one of the founders and proprietors of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society and has produced and appeared in films, radio dramas, games, music, and audiobook projects based on or inspired by Lovecraft's work, most notably the motion picture The Call of Cthulhu and the Dark Adventure Radio Theater series. They've recently released the newest episode of the Dark Adventure Radio Theater, which is the epically large Masks of Nyarlathotep, adapted from the famous Chaosium role-playing game of the same title. The show will be over 7 hours long. Links will be in the show notes. These Doth the Lord Hate was originally published in Weird Tales, January 1939. Narrating this is Eve Upton. Eve is huddled in the darkness of the cupboard. She appears to be scratching words into the floor. Upon closer inspection, they say, Nolite the bastardes carborundorum. Now, we have a story or 2 for you, and we promise you, they're true.
The Golgotha Dancers by Manly Wade Wellman. Narrated by Andrew Lehman. I had come to the art museum to see the special show of Goya prints, but that particular gallery was so crowded that I could hardly get in, much less see or savor anything, wherefore I walked out again. I wandered through the other wings with their rows and rows of oils, their Greek and Roman sculptures, their stern ranks of medieval armors, their oriental porcelains, their Egyptian gods. At length, by chance and not by design, I came to the head of a certain rear stairway. Other habitués of the museum will know the one I mean when I remind them that Arnold Buckland's The Isle of the Dead hangs on the wall of the landing. I started down, relishing in advance the impression Buckland's picture would make with its high brown rocks and black poplars, its midnight sky and gloomy film of sea, its single white figure erect in the bow of the beach-nosing skiff. But as I descended, I saw that the Isle of the Dead was not in its accustomed position on the wall. In that space, arresting even in the bad light and from the up angle of the stairs, hung a gilt-framed painting I had never seen or heard of in all my museum-haunting years. I gazed at it, one will imagine, all the way down to the landing. Then I had a close, searching look and a final, appraising stare from the lip of the landing above the lower half of the flight. So far as I can learn, and I have been diligent in my research, the thing is unknown even to the best informed of art experts. Perhaps it is as well that I describe it in detail. It seemed to represent action upon a small plateau or table rock, drab and bare, with the twilight sky deepening into a starless evening. This setting, restrainedly worked up in blue-grays and blue-blacks, was not the first thing to catch the eye, however. The front of the picture was filled with lively, dancing creatures, as pink, plump, and naked as cherubs, and as patently evil as the meditations of Satan in his rare idle moments. I counted those dancers. There were 12 of them, ranged in a half-circle, and they were cavorting in evident glee around a central object, a prone cross, which appeared to be made of 2 stout logs with some of the bark still upon them. To this cross, a pair of the pink things, that makes 14, kneeling and swinging blocky-looking hammers or mauls, spiked a human figure. I say human when I speak of that figure, and I withhold the word in describing the dancers and their hammer-wielding fellows. There is a reason. The supine victim on the cross was a beautifully represented male body, as clear and anatomically correct as an illustration in a surgical textbook. The head was writhed around as if in pain, and I could not see the face or its expression, but in the tortured tenseness of the muscles, in the slaty white sheen of the skin with jagged streaks of vivid gore upon it, agonized nature was plain and doubly plain. I could almost see the painted limbs writhe against the transfixing nails. By the same token, the dancers and hammerers were so dynamically done as to seem half in motion before my eyes. So much for the sound skill of the painter. Yet where the crucified prisoner was all clarity, these others were all fog, no lines, no angles, no muscles. Their features could not be seen or sensed. I was not even sure if they had hair or not. It was as if each was picked out with a ray of light in that surrounding dusk, light that revealed and yet shimmered indistinctly. Light, too, that had absolutely nothing of comfort or honesty in it. "Hold on there!" came a sharp challenge from the stairs behind and below me. "What are you doing, and what's that picture doing?" I started so that I almost lost my footing and fell upon the speaker, one of the museum guards. He was a slight old fellow, and his thin hair was grey, but he advanced upon me with all the righteous, angry pluck of a beefy policeman. His attitude surprised and nettled me. "I was going to ask somebody that same question," I told him as austerely as I could manage. "What about this picture? I thought there was a Buckland hanging here." The guard relaxed his forbidding attitude at first sound of my voice. "Oh, I beg your pardon, sir. I thought you was somebody else, the man who brought that thing." He nodded at the picture, and the hostile glare came back into his eyes. It so happened that he talked to me first, then to the curator, said it was art, great art, and the museum must have it. He lifted his shoulders in a shrug or a shudder. "Personally, I think it's plain beastly." So it was, I grew aware as I looked at it again. "And the museum has accepted it at last?" I prompted. He shook his head. "Oh, no, sir. An hour ago he was at the back door with that nasty daub there under his arm. I heard part of the argument. He got insulting, and he was told to clear out and take his picture with him. But he must have got in here somehow and hung it himself." Walking close to the painting, as gingerly as though he expected the pink dancers to leap out at him, he pointed to the lower edge of the frame. "If it was a real museum piece, we'd have a plate right there with the name of the painter and the title." I, too, came close. There was no plate, just as the guard had said. But in the lower left-hand corner of the canvas were sprawling capitals, pale paint on the dark, spelling out the word Golgotha. Beneath these, in small, barely readable script, "I sold my soul that I might paint a living picture." No signature or other clue to the artist's identity. The guard had discovered a great framed rectangle against the wall to one side. "Here's the picture he took down," he informed me, highly relieved. "Help me put it back, will you, sir? And do you suppose," here he grew almost wistful, "that we could get rid of this other thing before someone finds I let the crazy fool slip past me?" I took one edge of the Isle of the Dead and lifted it to help him hang it once more. "Tell you what," I offered on sudden impulse, "I'll take this Golgotha piece home with me, if you like." "Would you do that?" he almost yelled out in his joy at the suggestion. "Would you, to oblige me?" "To oblige myself," I returned. "I need another picture at my place." And the upshot of it was he smuggled me and the unwanted painting out of the museum. Never mind how. I've done quite enough as it is to jeopardize his job and my own welcome up there. It was not until I had paid off my taxi and lugged the unwieldy parallelogram of canvas and wood upstairs to my bachelor apartment that I bothered to wonder if it might be valuable. I never did find out, but from the first I was deeply impressed. Hung over my own fireplace, it looked as large and living as a scene glimpsed through a window, or perhaps on a stage in a theatre. The capering pink bodies caught new lights from my lamp, lights that glossed and intensified their shape and color, but did not reveal any new details. I pored once more over the cryptic legend, "I sold my soul that I might paint a living picture." A living picture, was it that? I could not answer. For all my honest delight in such things, I cannot be called expert or even knowing as regards art. Did I even like the Golgotha painting? I could not be sure of that either. And the rest of the inscription about selling a soul, I was considerably intrigued by that, and let my thoughts ramble on the subject of Satanist complexes and the vagaries of half-crazy painters. As I read that evening, I glanced up again and again at my new possession. Sometimes it seemed ridiculous, sometimes sinister. Shortly after midnight I rose, gazed once more, and then turned out the parlor lamp. For a moment, or so it seemed, I could see those dancers, so many dim pink silhouettes in the sudden darkness. I went to the kitchen for a bit of whiskey and water, and thence to my bedroom. I had dreams. In them I was a boy again, and my mother and sister were leaving the house to go to a theatre where, think of it, Richard Mansfield would play Beau Brummel. I, the youngest, was told to stay at home and mind the troublesome furnace. I wept copiously in my disappointed loneliness, and then Mansfield himself stalked in full Brummel regalia. He laughed goldenly and stretched out his hand in warm greeting. I, the lad of my dreams, put out my own hand, then was frightened when he would not loosen his grasp. I tugged, and he laughed again. The gold of his laughter turned suddenly hard, cold. I tugged with all my strength, and woke. Something held me tight by the wrist. In my first half-moment of wakefulness, I was aware that the room was filled with the pink dancers of the picture, in nimble, fierce, happy motion. They were man-sized, too, or nearly so, visible in the dark with the dim radiance of foxfire. On the small scale of the painting they had seemed no more than babyishly plump. Now they were gross, like huge erect toads. And as I awakened fully, they were closing in, a menacing ring of them around my bed. One stood at my right side, and its grip, clumsy and rubbery hard like that of a monkey, was closed upon my arm. I saw and sensed all this, as I say, in a single moment. With the sensing came the realization of peril, so great that I did not stop to wonder at the uncanniness of my visitors. I tried frantically to jerk loose. For the moment I did not succeed, and as I thrashed about, throwing my body nearly across the bed, a second dancer dashed in from the left. It seized and clamped my other arm. I felt, rather than heard, a wave of soft, wordless merriment from them all. My heart and sinews seemed to fail, and briefly I lay still, in a daze of horror, pinned down crucifix fashion between my two captors. Was that a hammer raised above me as I sprawled? There rushed and swelled into me the sudden startled strength that sometimes favors the desperate. I screamed like any wild thing caught in a trap, rolled somehow out of bed and to my feet. One of the beings I shook off, and the other I dashed against the bureau. Freed, I made for the bedroom door in the front of the apartment, stumbling and staggering on fear-weakened legs. One of the dim, shining pink things barred my way at the very threshold, and the others were closing in behind as if for a sudden rush. I flung my right fist with all my strength and weight. The being bobbed back unresistingly before my smash, like a rubber toy floating through water. I plunged past, reached the entry, and fumbled for the knob of the outer door. They were all about me then, their rubbery palms fumbling at my shoulders, my elbows, my pajama jacket. They would have dragged me down before I could negotiate the lock. A racking shudder possessed me and seemed to flick them clear. Then I stumbled against a stand, and purely by good luck my hand fell upon a bamboo walking stick. I yelled again in truly hysterical fierceness, and laid about me as with a whip. My blows did little or no damage to those unearthly assailants, but they shrank back, teetering and dancing to a safe distance. Again I had the sense that they were laughing, mocking. For the moment I had beaten them off, but they were sure of me in the end. Just then my groping free hand pressed a switch. The entry sprang into light. On the instant, they were not there. Somebody was knocking outside, and with trembling fingers I turned the knob of the door. In came a tall, slender girl with a blue lounging robe caught hurriedly around her. Her bright hair was disordered, as though she had just sprung from her bed. "Is someone sick?" she asked in a breathless voice. "I lived down the hall. I heard cries." Her round blue eyes were studying my face, which must have been ghastly pale. "You see, I'm a trained nurse, and perhaps—" "Thank God you did come," I broke in, unceremoniously but honestly, and went before her to turn on every lamp in the parlor. It was she who, without guidance, searched out my whiskey and siphon and mixed for me a highball of grateful strength. My teeth rang nervously on the edge of the glass as I gulped it down. After that I got my own robe, a becoming one with satin facings, and sat with her on the divan to tell of my adventure. When I had finished, she gazed long at the painting of the dancers, then back at me. Her eyes, like two chips of the April sky, were full of concern, and she held her rosy lower lip between her teeth. I thought that she was wonderfully pretty. "What a perfectly terrible nightmare," she said. "It was no nightmare," I protested. She smiled and argued the point, telling me all manner of comforting things about mental associations and their reflections in vivid dreams. To clinch her point, she turned to the painting. "This line about a living picture is the peg on which your slumbering mind hung the whole fabric," she suggested, her slender fingertip touching the painted scribble. "Your very literal subconscious self didn't understand that the artist meant his picture would live only figuratively." "Are you sure that's what the artist meant?" I asked. But finally I let her convince me. One can imagine how badly I wanted to be convinced. She mixed me another highball and a short one for herself. Over it she told me her name, Miss Dolby, and finally she left me with a last comforting assurance. But nightmare or no, I did not sleep again that night. I sat in the parlor among the lamps, smoking and dipping into book after book. Countless times I felt my gaze drawn back to the painting over the fireplace, with the cross and the nail-pierced wretch and the shimmering pink dancers. After the rising sun had filled the apartment with its honest light and cheer, I felt considerably calmer. I slept all morning, and in the afternoon was disposed to agree with Miss Dolby that the whole business had been a bad dream, nothing more. Dressing, I went down the hall, knocked on her door, and invited her to dinner with me. It was a good dinner. Afterward we went to an amusing motion picture, with Charles Butterworth in it, as I remember. After bidding her good night, I went to my own place. Undressed and in bed, I lay awake. My late morning slumber made my eyes slow to close. Thus it was that I heard the faint shuffle of feet, and sitting up against my pillows saw the glowing silhouettes of the Golgotha dancers. Alive and magnified, they were creeping into my bedroom. I did not hesitate or shrink this time. I sprang up, tense and defiant. "No, you don't," I yelled at them. As they seemed to hesitate before the impact of my wild voice, I charged frantically. For a moment I scattered them and got through the bedroom door as on the previous night. There was another shindy in the entry. This time they all got hold of me like a pack of hounds and wrestled me back against the wall. I writhe even now when I think of the unearthly hardness of their little gripping paws. 2 on each arm were spread-eagling me upon the plaster, the cruciform position again. I swore, yelled, and kicked. One of them was in the way of my foot. He floated back unhurt. That was their strength and horror, their ability to go flabby and non-resistant under smashing, flattening blows. Something tickled my palm, pricked it, the point of a spike. "Miss Dolby!" I shrieked, as a child might call for its mother. "Help! The door flew open. I must not have locked it. "Here I am," came her unafraid reply. She was outlined against the rectangle of light from the hall. My assailants let go of me to dance toward her. She gasped, but did not scream. I staggered along the wall, touched a light switch, and the parlour just beyond us flared into visibility. Miss Dolby and I ran into the lamp, rallying there as Stone Age folk must have rallied at their fire to face the monsters of the night. I looked at her. She was still fully dressed, as I had left her, apparently had been sitting up. Her rouge made flat patches on her pale cheeks, but her eyes were level. This time the dancers did not retreat or vanish. They lurked in the comparative gloom of the entry, jigging and trembling as if mustering their powers and resolutions for another rush at us. "You see," I chattered out to her, "it wasn't a nightmare." She spoke, not in reply, but as if to herself. "They have no faces," she whispered. "No faces." In the half-light that was diffused upon them from our lamp, they presented the featurelessness of so many huge gingerbread boys, covered with pink icing. One of them, some kind of leader, pressed forward within the circle of the light. It daunted him a bit. He hesitated, but did not retreat. From my centre table, Miss Dolby had picked up a bright paper cutter. She poised it with the assurance of one who knows how to handle cutting instruments. "When they come," she said steadily, "let's stand close together. We'll be harder to drag down that way." I wanted to shout my admiration of her fearless front toward the dreadful beings, my thankfulness for her quick run to my rescue. All I could mumble was, "You're mighty brave." She turned for a moment to look at the picture above my dying fire. My eyes followed hers. I think I expected to see a blank canvas, find that the painted dancers had vanished from it and had grown into the living ones. But they were still in the picture, and the cross and the victim were there too. Miss Dolby read aloud the inscription. A living picture. The artist knew what he was talking about after all. Couldn't a living picture be killed, I wondered? It sounded uncertain, and a childish quibble to boot, but Miss Dolby exclaimed triumphantly, as at an inspiration. "Killed? Yes," she shouted. She sprang at the picture, darting out with the paper cutter. The point ripped into one of the central figures in the dancing semicircle. All the crowd in the entry seemed to give a concerted throb, as of startled protest. I swung, heart racing, to front them again. What had happened? Something had changed, I saw. The intrepid leader had vanished. No, he had not drawn back into the group. He had vanished. Miss Dolby, too, had seen. She struck again, gashed the painted representation of another dancer, and this time the vanishing happened before my eyes. A creature at the rear of the group went out of existence as suddenly and completely as though a light had blinked out. The others, driven by their danger, rushed. I met them, feet planted. I tried to embrace them all at once, went over backward under them. I struck, wrenched, tore. I think I even bit something grisly and bloodless like fungoid tissue, but I refused to remember for certain. One or two of the forms struggled past me and grappled Miss Dolby. I struggled to my feet and pulled them back from her. There were not so many swarming after me now. I fought hard before they got me down again, and Miss Dolby kept tearing and stabbing at the canvas again. Clutches melted from my throat, my arms. There were only 2 dancers left. I flung them back and rose. Only one left. Then none. They were gone into nowhere. "That did it," said Miss Dolby breathlessly. She had pulled the picture down. It was only a frame now, with ragged ribbons of canvas dangling from it. I snatched it out of her hands and threw it upon the coals of the fire. "Look," I urged her joyfully, "it's burning. That's the end. Do you see?" "Yes, I see," she answered slowly. "Some fiend-ridden artist, his evil genius, brought it to life." "The inscription is the literal truth, then?" I supplied. "Truth no more." She bent to watch the burning. As the painted figures were destroyed, their incarnations faded. We said nothing further, but sat down together and gazed as the flames ate the last thread of fabric, the last splinter of wood. Finally, we looked up again and smiled at each other. All at once I knew that I loved her.
These Doth the Lord Hate by Manly Wade Wellman, originally published in Weird Tales, January 1939. Narrated by Eve Upton. Before me lies open E. A. Ashwin's translation of Compendium Maleficarum, just as 300 years ago the original lay open before judges and preachers, a notable source of warning against and indictment of witchcraft. And from its pages have risen 3 folk long dead. The magic that gives them life is that of imagination, concerning which power Brother Francesco Maria Guazzo writes with sober learning in the very first chapter of the compendium. Their simple embalming was a lone paragraph, barely 150 words in length, one of Guazzo's various and ample examples, with the sole purpose that men, considering the cunning of witches, might study to live piously and devoutly in the Lord. Guazzo has written shortly and with reserve, though never dryly, and in 1608, when the compendium was first printed under the patronage of Cardinal Orazio Maffei, his style was adequate. James I of England still shuddered over the memory of Dr. Fiennes' conspiracy with Satan to destroy him. In Bredburn near Cologne lived a dozen or more aging men who horrifiedly had seen a captured wolf turn back into their neighbour, the damnable Peter Stumpf. Gilles Grenier, prisoned in a Franciscan friary at Bordeaux, would cheerfully tell any visitor his adventures as a devil-gifted warlock, shapeshifter, and cannibal. But times and beliefs have changed. Since Guazzo himself foresaw that his book might provoke the idle jests of the censorious, let his shade not vex me if I embroider his brief, plain citation. The phenomenon occurred near Treves, upon the goodly river Mosella, immediately east of the present Franco-German border. Some know Treves ancient and pleasant, with a cathedral where is preserved a coat of Jesus to call forth the world's wonder and worship. Around the town, now, as in Guazzo's time, are pleasant fields and gardens. The scene we are to consider, though unfolding upon a land properly German, is more than a trifle French. In the district of Treves, writes Guazzo and translates Ashwin, a peasant was planting cabbage with his 8-year-old daughter. Frenchmen hold cabbages in notable esteem and affection. A favourite love name throughout the provinces and environs of France is cabbage. Without good store of this vegetable, no Moselle farm would be perfect, and certainly no Moselle stew. The peasant was planting, and so it was spring. A fair day with the sky clear and bright, as we shall observe. Our man of the soil comes readily to life before us, stooping and delving at the fresh, good-smelling furrow. He seems a sturdy fellow, sharp-featured like a Gaul, blonde-bearded like a Teuton. His widely spread feet are encased in wooden shoes. He wears a loose, drab frock and a shapeless cap. For all the distance of years, he is amazingly like a peasant cabbage grower of today. and beside him, as we have read, works his daughter, 8 years old. Is that not young to be a gardener? Yet she is a vigorous and intelligent and willing beyond her years. The trowel and seed bag seem to do their own duty in her small, quick hands. Her father is deeply impressed. He, continues the commentator, praised the girl highly for the work. The young maid, whose sex and age combined to make her talkative, boasted that she could do more wonderful things than that, and then her father asked what they were. It is well worth another full stop to consider that complete picture, one of rustic endeavour, not too heavy or too distasteful, especially when the gardeners are so bound together in mutual understanding and affection. Seed sowers of today can understand father's pride in his industrious daughter. How well you dig, my little cabbage! And his eyes crinkle up in his good-nature's brown face as he enjoys his own play upon words. He doubts honestly if there was ever such a good child. She is a true daughter of her mother. And here he turns to glance over his shoulder at the house above the garden, small but snug and well repaired, with ample gush of smoke from the chimney-hole. His wife is evidently concocting the noonday meal. Something more than bread and soup, he warrants. He is mystified at the plenty of good things she provides, as if she got it by enchantment. I will grant that the picture is too bright, too cheerful. Were it fiction, we might borrow from Edgar Allan Poe the device of a black cloud dimming the sky. But perhaps the contrast will be the greater with things as they are. The excellent child finds the more savour in her father's commendation because she knows that well she deserves it. Nor is she backward in telling him that planting cabbages is not her lone virtue and study. Other of her talents may please and benefit him. Again, Guazzo. She said, "Go away a little, and I will quickly make it rain on whatever part of the garden you wish." And father, it takes no further effort of the mind's eye to see that peasant visage broaden and the beard stir in a great grin. This daughter of his never fails to warm his heart. Surely she must have heard him say that rain would be welcome in this planting season. As she grows older, she will hear from a priest that only God Almighty can send rain. But her pretence is innocent. Today let her have her fun, play a game, and make them both laugh. Guazzo calls the good man astonished, but more probably he achieves an elaborate burlesque of surprise as he says, "Come then, I will go a little away." Jovially, he tramps off 50 paces or so, taking care not to tread on the freshly seeded cabbage rows. He and his daughter have gone far ahead of their intentions this morning. There can be a minute or two of rest and sport. He pauses and turns. Now, for the first time, perhaps he scowls. The child has caught up a gnarled stick and is beating up a froth of mud in a shallow trench. She is speaking, too, or saying a litany. He can catch only the rhythmic sound of her voice, no words. And behold, there fell from the clouds a sudden rain upon the said place. From the clouds. Whence came those clouds so suddenly? And now this deluge. From his point apart, the cabbage farmer stares. His shoulders hunch in his loose smock, as though they supported a sudden heavy weight. His sabot dig into the earth. One square-fingered hand steals upwards to sign the cross upon his thick chest. And over yonder falls a rain as no such Christian cares to see, heavy and narrow. It is shimmery, drenching column of down-darting water, no thicker than a round tower of the Baron's castle at Trevas, but tall as infinity. He can hear it, too, a drumming rattle on the thirsty clods, like the patterned dance gambols of light, impious hoofs. He crosses himself again, and the rain is over, as abruptly and completely as it began. Now is the time for him to inquire in his heart if indeed he saw and heard rightly. He knows that he did. The The rain is gone, but there remains a circular patch of earth all churned to mud, and here comes trotting his daughter, smiling and triumphant, and her garments are drenched. Her eyes sparkle. So sparkled the eyes of her mother no later than last Sunday, when a roast of pig came to the rough table as if from nowhere. The hungry husband did not ask about it then. Now the question burns him, whence came that meat? All this detail is romance, a careless padding of Guazzo's narrative, which is much shorter and balder. The astounded father asked, "Who taught you to do this?" She answered, "My mother did, and she is very clever at this and other things like it." We may assure ourselves that there will be no more cabbage planting this day. The peasant nods dumbly and plucks at the hem of his smock. Then he clears his throat and says the sun is high and the midday meal is undoubtedly ready. Together they go to the hut above the garden, the man's sabot thudding heavily and lifelessly, the child's bare feet skipping and dancing. A hearty, rosy-cheeked woman greets them loudly at the door. To be sure, dinner is ready, but he who suggested a stoppage of work to eat, he finds himself unable to swallow a crumb. Finally he rises, lurches rather than walks from the door. Nearby is a secluded spot. We can readily visualize it as a clump of bushy young trees beside a narrow creek. Into that hiding plunges the peasant. Screened by the trunks and branches, he sinks wretchedly to his knees. He feels that this is not enough of humility. His face droops, his shoulders go slack, and a moment later he lies prostrate upon the shadowed mould of last year's leaves. There he prays for an hour and an hour. Sometimes he finds words to say. Oftener he achieves only moans and unaccustomed tears. Can he not be forgiven for having merciful doubts as to his duty in this case? Even the Saviour once pleaded that a bitter cup be withheld from his lips. But the peasant makes a shift to rise at last. His face is set as firmly as the carven granite of Saint on the cathedral's doorway yonder in Treves. True, his hands tremble a little, as Abraham's hands must have trembled as they lifted to sacrifice Isaac at God's command. But the final answer has come to his heart, and he knows what to do. Here is that answer, as Guazzo gives it. The peasant nobly faced his right and plain duty, so a few days later, on the pretence that he had been invited to a wedding, hid his wife and daughter, dressed in festal wedding robes, to the neighbouring town, where he handed them over to the judge to be punished for the crime of witchcraft. It is hard to imagine how the man lived during those intervening few days. It is impossible to divine what were his arts and powers that he kept a smiling face and calm manner, while his heart smouldered like a coal from the smithy. And the plan of betrayal, that was a shrewd one, and worthy of the greatest witch-finder, let alone a peasant. Yet I doubt if he congratulated himself upon it. They go to the fair town of Treves, all three in holiday gear. Sometimes on that journey the little rainmaker must have been weary, and rode perforce on father's shoulder. Was his arm tighter than usual around her little body? Did his voice quiver as he answered some questions she prattled? I make no doubt of that, but from Guazzo we know what end of the jaunt turned out to be. Of a sudden the mother and daughter are in the hands of the judge and a guard of his men-at-arms. With what fierce scorn does the witch-woman deny the charges until, after hours of questioning and perhaps a touch of the lash or thumbscrew, she makes a confession. True, she is a sorceress. She has signed the devil's book, attended the Sabbat, sworn the oath of evil. She has schooled her daughter to the like infamy. Look elsewhere in Guazzo's absorbing compendium for what must have been the rest of the story. Death by fire, he says confidently, is the only right punishment for the dreadful sin of witchcraft. A stake, therefore, is set upright in the marketplace of Treves, and heaped about with faggots. To this the witch and her fledgling are borne, high upon the armoured shoulders of the law's servants. With the last of her tears, the older culprit pleads and prays that she be allowed to walk. Sternly, the judge refuses this request. Is it not a commonplace that a witch, going to execution, need but touch toe to the earth for her bonds to dissolve and her executioners to fall as if struck by lightning? The double witch burning is a rare treat and curiosity in Treves, and it receives the attention it merits. Not a soul in all the district, from the baron of the castle to the beggars whose home and heritage is the gutter, but must draw near to see. No, that is not strictly true. Not every soul in the district is present at the burning, for a solitary man trudges away to his empty home by the cabbage garden. His big hands are locked behind him. His chin weighs like lead upon his breast. The lines of his face teem with tears. He dares to utter the supplication refused by the priest at the cathedral, a timid prayer that two spirits, even now taking flight, shall not be utterly consumed in hell. O Lord, let them win at last through long punishment and sincere repentance to some measure of comfort in a most humble corner of heaven. Not all agonies are of the fire.
I was introduced to the weird stories of Manly Wade Wellman by way of Mike Mignola, who name-checked Wellman as one of his favorite writers and drew considerable inspiration from Wellman's Appalachian folk horror stories from writing the Hellboy tale, The Crooked Man. Years ago, I wrote an essay comparing Mignola and Wellman, pointing out that both of them had a real knack for taking bits and pieces of real-life folklore and investing it with so much of their own imagination that it became impossible to tell where folklore ended and their creations began. These Doth the Lord Hate is a good example of Wellman doing just that. What seems, at first glance, like a pretty standard tale of witchcraft and the grim consequences thereof, transforms subtly through Wellman's playful metafictional embellishments. Even his throwaway details act as antics and frets, tempting portals to other tales of deviltry. For all that I love Wellman's work, I still haven't read all of it, and prior to agreeing to host this installment of Pseudopod, The Golgotha Dancers was one of those stories that I had somehow missed. Of course, I fell in love with it immediately. From that opening sentence, where the unnamed narrator misses out on a special show of Goya prints, we know exactly what kind of story we're getting into, don't we? And of course, I've always been enamored with the motif of the haunted painting, which is really not so different than the haunted book, the haunted film, and so on. As much as I adored the story, though, with its fungoid, pink, ill-defined dancers, it wasn't until Mike Bukowski mentioned something about it on Facebook that I fully realized why. For those who aren't familiar with his work, Michael Bukowski is an artist and madball collector who has taken upon himself the daunting task of drawing every monster that Lovecraft ever mentioned, plus quite a few others. So naturally, he's a man after my own heart. You can find his work on his website, Yalblogsoth, or on Instagram at illustro_obscurum. What he pointed out was that the Golgotha Dancers is actually a gender-flipped damsel in distress story, complete with Miss Dolby, who the narrator calls out for as a child might call for its mother, rushing to his aid like a knight in shining armor, with a paper cutter standing in nicely for a sword. Not too shabby for a story that was first published in 1937. If you like what you heard today, you can support quality audio productions and keep us from having to foist our art upon unsuspecting museums by going to pseudopod.org and clicking on Feed the Pod. Pseudopod is part of the Escape Artists Incorporated and is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Theme music is by permission of Anders Manga. Pseudopod knows that you only listen to these stories of deviltry and witchcraft so that you might live more piously and devoutly. But on the off chance that you want to sell your soul to create a living painting, well, now you know a little about that too.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.